Welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. This is Adam Stutz.
And I'm Heather Watson.
How you doing, friend?
I'm doing well. How about you? How was your Thanksgiving?
It was good. We spent time with family down in San Diego. But yeah, it was good. It was relaxing. Ate a lot of food.
What was
So,
your favorite food?
ooh, tough. Are we talking desserts
I
or
was just about to say you can choose one
regular
savory
dishes?
and one,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to say the fried chicken that we had was delish.
You guys had it catered, right?
We did. We did. There is a soul food place that is not far from where my sister-in-law lives, and we get food catered from there every Thanksgiving. It's fantastic. But fried chicken for savory and sweet potato pie for the sweet. So delicious. But we had fried chicken, we had catfish, we had brisket, greens, potato salad, sweet potatoes, mac and cheese, and cornbread, and sweet potato pie, key lime cake, and a bunch of other like cookies and other things. So I was basically in a coma by like 6.
I love that you guys went outside of like the normal or traditional
Mm-hmm.
Thanksgiving dinner. Like that's an interesting spread.
Yeah, turkey's really not a thing in our household. In fact, I don't think we've had a turkey since Destiny and I like lived in San Diego. So
Mm.
it's been a really long time. But yeah, we don't really do the traditional Thanksgiving, and it's kind of awesome actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading an article on Thanksgiving and it's talking about turkeys and turkey pardoning, all this other stuff. But basically the headline was like, why do we keep eating turkey? Nobody likes it. Like why are we all lying to ourselves? It's dry and bland and
Yeah. Yeah, I don't it's funny cuz I don't really remember a point in time where I like crave turkey. I don't mind stuffing or dressing, I guess depending on what part of the country you're coming from, but I do like that. But yeah, how about you? What ended up being your favorite foods?
um probably the stuffing in terms of savory. That was tasty. But then I made the desserts as I do. I made
Mmm.
pumpkin pie. I wasn't going to, but my brother demanded it. So I made pumpkin pie and apple galettes. So
Nice.
like a rustic apple tart kind of thing, and homemade whipped cream. So I think the apple galette was my favorite of the two, but the I was pretty pleased with my pumpkin pie this year also. So I mean, very biased and like the desserts were the best.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and it's interesting you bring up the apple galettes because Destiny actually just made a bunch of apple galettes and stuff
Oh yeah.
for the first time, and she did a really good job actually.
Nice. Oh, actually,
So
I think she invited me over to make those and I was busy doing something else.
they were really good. Yeah, they were really good. Um, but and then do you have any Christmas plans coming up?
Nothing big, just family stuff. Nothing super exciting. I think maybe some stuff will fall together, but you guys have some stuff coming up though, right? You're going to a Christmas market.
Yes, yeah, really excited. I have no idea what to expect, but I'm assuming that there's gonna be good food and we will probably, get to see some great decorations and just walk around, kind of sampling treats and stuff. So I think that that's kind of the goal with the Christmas market. But yeah, I have no idea what to expect, but I'm sure it's going to be wonderful. We used to go to a big festival in San Diego, in Balboa Park. It's their Festival of Lights,
Nice.
and that was always a lot of fun. So on this week's episode, we had Karla Lamb and Joseph Milazzo, and I enjoyed both my conversations with them. What I love about Carla's work is there's a lot of kind of like painterly textures, as I call them, and she has a kind of Whitmanian quality to it, as in like Walt Whitman, and we talked a lot about the form that Jericho Brown created called the duplex, which is in fact the title of her poem Duplex in the Key of Life, after Jericho Brown, with a line by Sarah Borjas. And yeah, it was just, all in all, it was a great conversation. Karla is a force of nature within the LA poetry scene. She's a fantastic poet, but she's also a really great community organizer, activist. She runs Verse for Verse and Perverse for Verse, which is the more adult sapphic open mic. And yeah, she's just a really great contributor. I've known her for a little while. Yeah, she's a wonderful poet. I really, really like her. And Joseph Milazzo, I really enjoy his work. He writes these very tight, kind of surreal lyrics. They have a William S. quality, but as I described them in our interview, it's more of like if William Carlos Williams was into hardcore punk and skateboarding. And I think one of the best parts of the conversation, in my opinion, was when we were talking about maximalism and like what qualifies as being maximalist. And all in all, it was just a really interesting conversation. And yeah, I really like talking to them.
Yeah, I mean, going back to Karla, you guys had a really great conversation about identity.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought you asked some really pointed questions about identity and how that may or may not influence the work, as in like the writing, like the production of the work.
Mm-hmm.
And Karla, you know, she brought up good points about the work standing on its own, kind of regardless of any perspective of identity,
Mm-hmm.
but then also sort of like the corollary of the importance of identity and representation and sort of, providing work that, somebody can relate to because of the identity presented, that kind of thing. So it's just an interesting conversation that you guys had. And obviously coming from you as a writer as well, and how you relate to identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um, when you were talking to Joe and sort of talking about the decision of what a piece of work may be in terms of form, whether it's poetry or for him, like possibly a novel, he made the point that he kind of trusts the work to tell him, like to be what it wants to be or
Mm-hmm.
to like take form naturally.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually made me think of something that I heard Destiny talking about because she was she's reading Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, I think
Mm-hmm.
it's called.
Mm-hmm.
And she talked about a very similar thing that he was talking about, of like tuning in and making yourself available to receiving
Mm-hmm.
ideas, and just this overarching idea of respecting and trusting your ideas and inspiration, whatever form that it may take, and just creating space for that, inspiration to speak to you,
Mm-hmm.
and allow that to be what it wants to be. So
Yeah.
it's just interesting, I mean, as a creative person myself in a different way, but um we often try and like force things into creation, and it just simply does not work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
it's a good reminder to just like trust that the ideas will take form
Yeah.
in the right sort of intended way.
Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great point. And actually, Destiny and I just had that conversation today because I was struggling with some writing, and she also emphasized to me. She said, you can't force it sometimes, because then she said if you start forcing it, then it begins to become like busy work. And I think there's a
Yeah.
lot of debate over whether or not, at least insofar as like writing's concerned, when you're in the process of writing, like, even if you're writing badly, that you're still writing with the intention of, working within the act of writing. And so it's important to consider that possibility.
Hmm.
Here's my interviews with Karla Lamb and Joseph Milazzo. Karla Lamb, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. I'm so glad to have you here. And I wanted to have you start by reading Duplex in the Key of Life after Jericho Brown, with a line from Sarah Borjas.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is a pleasure. Yeah, thank you for accepting the piece. This is, like you said, Duplex in the Key of Life after Jericho Brown. Can't distract a man from his instrument All I can hear are my own hard swallows. All I can hear are my own hard swallows. Can't be a woman who swallows with needs. Can't be a woman or an instrument who needs space. Can't be too distracting. Men need space. Can't speak too loudly. Be heard. Take up space. Men like silence made by women who don't distract from their instrument. Men make the opposite of silence. Call it affection. How much space do instruments need to swallow? In the stillness of swallowing, don't distract me. How much swallowing do I need to do to get affection? For so long, I've wanted to be his instrument.
Yeah, I love this poem. Both your writing and your reading of your work have these rich painterly textures that for me evoke the complexities of murals, and in a true like Whitmanian sense of the words, like it contains multitudes. Your
Mm.
lyricism is punctuated with this kind of contrapuntal quality. Almost feels like your voice is operating in these two different melodies that are in conversation with one another. And your writing has these broad lines that feel like they can be at home in a cityscape as well as walking along a desolate highway. And I was just wondering if you can talk, I guess to start off our conversation, if you could talk about your writing process and how these lines unfold and how this kind of painterly quality of your writing unfolds.
Wow, what an amazing interpretation. Like thank you so much. I love what you just described my work in words that I wouldn't even use. But in describing my creative process, I remember the day I wrote this poem. It was during a time when I was writing in my journal as an exercise for 15 minutes, at least 15 minutes a day. And I had the line, all I could hear are my own hard swallows for a really long time. And I think I'm trying to remember the line from Sarah Borges. I know I quoted it in the poem, and I'm pretty sure that's it. Like that was the impetus. And I should probably go look at which one of her poems uses it. And I listened to a lot of podcasts, and it might have been something I just heard. But I just think it's such a great image. It's so visceral and it's so sensory, so tangible, and it's also like as a woman, like I could really just like it just evokes so many emotions, and I just really fell in love with that line. Also at the time it was summer. I was really enthralled by Jericho Brown's book tradition, in which he writes a lot of duplex poems, and multiple poems in that book are called duplex. So duplex is a form that Jericho Brown invented, and it's basically a ghazal and a jazz and a sonnet. It's a mixture of those forms, but also it breaks some of those rules.
Mm.
And I was just so like drawn to this form, and I wanted to imitate it, right? So like I was like, oh, I'll try my hand at a duplex.
Mm-hmm.
Coincidentally, I was living in a duplex at the time. I was breaking up with somebody at the time, and like these lines just were just honestly kind of born out of me, just like I hate to be that poet, but it's true. And the form really lends itself to, obviously, repetition as part of the form, and it was easy enough for me to take that line, all I can hear are my own heart swallows, and just play with it and really
Mm-hmm.
stretch out that scene. And that's what I do a lot of the time with my creative process. Is I'll be writing in a journal, probably a line or two from my notes app, to be completely honest. Because as a poet out in the world, like, I don't usually have a journal with me
Mm-hmm.
on the go, just snippets and images and words and lines in my notes app,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of people these days. And then what I call a sketch when I'm actually using a pen and paper. And then I'll transfer that over to the computer and play with it, sit with it. This poem didn't get a lot of edits. I did take it to workshop once or twice. I sent it to a couple friends. Some people had, like, pretty good feedback, but also I'm pretty hard-headed when it comes to, like, of course I want people's opinions and I want constructive criticism, but I felt that this poem was finished, which is
Mm-hmm.
also rare.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a lot of poems like simmer and sit in the drawer for a little while. But yeah, but because I think it is true to the form, and I like an homage to Jericho Brown's duplex poems. And of course, I break some of the rules within it as well. So yeah, that's the creative process for me. It's
Mm-hmm.
just like, obviously, the life experience, the emotion, what do I want to say, the narrative of what I want to say.
Mm-hmm.
Those are my best pieces, when there's a story, there's an experience in it. But of course, with creative license and poetic license, you can kind of uh, use it to mold what the piece is essentially gonna say, and
Mm-hmm.
what it wants to say. Because I could sit here and tell you what I'm exactly referring to, but I don't think that's the purpose of art necessarily. Like, I want the reader to resonate with the piece on their own terms. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to hold anyone's hand telling them what it means. So yeah, that's the long answer.
Cool. I it's interesting because for me it's this idea of obviously tapestry and weaving kind of like factors into my own writing process, and you made me think about the fact that when I write, I tend to write in a journal, and then like I will extrapolate work from there, and then that kind of will end up molding into to whatever that poem will be like. And so there's something about the way that that process unfolds that I feel like is a very I don't know. It's a very fluid process and stuff, and kind of like will shape itself in this very interesting way. When I think back to the kind of the Whitmanian qualities of your work and this idea of the poet, the speaker, and the poem containing multitudes, so much of our identities again are woven in and out of our work in kind of glaring ways, and then sometimes in more subtle ways. And I was wondering, how do you feel you engage with identity showing up in your work? Is it something that acts as like a starting point, or do you find that it manifests on its own and it's only after, like, apparent after the poem has been completed?
I think it really just depends, right? Like, depends on the piece specifically. I know it's kind of fun to dissect this particular piece. And yeah, I think I do write from my newest work is definitely from a queer perspective, a
Mm-hmm.
queer speaker. And even though I've identified as queer since I was 15, I wasn't as concerned of, like, letting that aspect of my own identity come in out into the piece.
Mm-hmm.
And not to keep it as, like, elusive or abstract. I mean, if someone really wanted to know or wanted that perspective, they could see it in my bio. And also, like, the political choice to include that in the bio. But yeah, within this poem in particular, I've come to have a little distance from it, because
Mm-hmm.
it is maybe a year and a half old now, but it still hits, like, pretty hard. So I read it recently at an event that I did, an event that I hosted. And I always say, like, oh, I'm going to read an original piece because this is my show, right? Shout out Verse for Verse. That's the queer open mic that I host monthly in East Los Angeles. But the pronouns in this piece are very much, he, him, his.
Mm-hmm.
when standing alone, like you don't know if the speaker is like female or not. Like it's really abstract in the piece. Like you don't know who that
Mm-hmm.
speaker is, right? And also pronouns can be anything,
Mm-hmm.
honestly, these days, right? I was listening to some Fiona Apple lyrics and like she's kind of like a queer icon, you know, in the queer zeitgeist. But I've always kind of thought like she uses a lot of he, him, his pronouns. Like the singer is singing to presumably a him,
Mm-hmm.
but then as my mind has grown, my mind is like less in this like binary these
Mm-hmm.
days. I'm kind of expanding my mentality and thinking like, oh, she really, I mean, who knows, that person that like Fiona Apple or the singer is singing to doesn't necessarily have to be a male, first of
Mm-hmm.
all, you know,
Mm-hmm.
at all. So, and then I my own relationship to this piece kind of felt better. Like
Sure.
I yes, I mean, but this is very explicitly about like men and man. Like the poem doesn't hide behind like, ooh, this is could be queer. Like it's
Right. Yeah.
like men like silence, men need space, you know. So it's like very interesting. The speaker definitely has some strong opinions, and the you know just to go back to like my own personal experience, this is definitely how I felt and feel about like what happened to me in a relationship with a man.
Sure.
So I don't necessarily hide behind, ooh, what could it be?
Yeah.
You know, the mystery of it all. But yeah, I think it's very important to say, you know, like yes, I'm neurodivergent. Yes, I am anxious. Yes, I am queer. And like those things, I don't know, like guide the reader and
Mm-hmm.
also like maybe let make the reader feel less alone because they are looking to us as those kind of like pioneers or spokespeople in those communities,
Yeah.
honestly.
Yeah.
I think that's great and wonderful when people do. Do I think the poem stands alone without me having to say like, oh, this is a cis heteronormative relationship? Like, yeah.
Yeah.
Do I think it stands alone without my bio? Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
and yeah,
I feel like because I realized that the whole debate around like identity politics these days and stuff, like I think it's ridiculous. And like and
mm,
I love people being able to write from places. Obviously authenticity is a very loaded word, but like I think that writing from writing from all the dynamism that's like part of a person's experience, and like how like one identifies in their life, and those kind of signals, like you said. Like I like that idea of creating things in poems that act like beacons, like you're sending up like signal fires to like other people, and that like and that helps is in terms of like bolstering not only community and stuff, but also expanding awareness and like making people
yeah.
like aware of a broader and larger like world outside of themselves. And so like that's the thing that that I love. And like and I think the embrace of identity is a great thing, because it's like I learn more about the person that be it the poet, the speaker in the poem, like maybe even the poem itself and stuff. Like all those different like qualities tend to like emerge. And so like it's an important conversation to have, but I feel
Mm,
like it's like one of those things where it's like it gets, sometimes it can get bogged down in the politics, and it's like we're leaving the people out of the conversation and stuff. And so like I
mm,
like it in terms of like being able to be like, no, I want to learn about all these different aspects of the person. So this is like how I do that. And like and the idea of you being able to kind of like being able to operate like essentially like on a spectrum, and like being able to like
yeah.
move back and forth. And that goes back to that whole idea
Mm.
of like fluidity.
I love the idea of fluidity and I love representation. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I often think about like when I was coming up as a poet in my younger years, formative years. I mean, obviously there's a vast important history of queer poets. And we stand on the shoulders of giants, obviously, but yeah, we can never have enough of that.
Mm-hmm.
And even though this poem, I think is very much, I like to call it like the pronoun game. You
Yeah.
know, like we never get a name, we never
Yeah.
get any kind of, the he in the poem doesn't have any kind of features. There's no defining features of this person
Yeah.
at all. So it could, again, it's a spectrum. Like men are not
Mm-hmm.
monolith, so like, so to
Sure.
speak, so it could be any men, it could be
Yeah.
trans men, gay men, like that. So I love that the poem can play with that a little bit. And I'm honest, I'm as the poet, I'm projecting and imposing that meaning onto it because it also came from me as a queer person.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know what a reader would project onto the piece if they read it, like just standing alone. And but also that's kind of the magic of it could resonate with just about anyone.
Yeah. Well, and I think it goes back to your earlier point about the fact that you're hoping that your readers will bring their own subjective interpretation to the poem, and that the experience and the like kind of like those really not only your experience but the experience of like the speaker in the poem are going to they're going to be interpreted how they will and stuff, like filtered through the lens of the person that's reading the poem. And so that and I think that in of itself is one of the things that's like really wonderful about your work, is I think it does a very good job of accomplishing that, like being able to draw the reader in and then being able to infuse their own experience
Mm.
into this poem, and then allowing that to then take on a whole new meaning and like a whole other like set of dimensions and experiences and stuff that are applicable to the to the reader.
Yeah, totally. I actually had that reaction the other day when I read it at the reading. A queer friend of mine was like, "Wow, that poem like fucking hits." And
Mm-hmm.
this is somebody that dates like their same like gender, and like that to me was actually extremely just I loved hearing that
Mm-hmm.
from someone in the queer community. Just like, wow, like that hits regardless, and like, wow, thank you.
Yeah.
And speaking of authenticity, I don't know, I was kind of debating like how petty I wanted to be about this poem, and I'm really glad it's in the journal. And by petty, I kind of mean like, I mean it is about an ex, and now I'm like extremely happy that it's out in the world. Just kind of
Mm-hmm.
like the little stab, like you called me toxic, and I made art out of it,
Right.
and here you go.
Yeah.
Thank you actually.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I think that's the other thing. It's that it makes people realize that these experiences are well, they all have like unique characteristics, so, like how we break up with people, the pain that we endure, the toxicity that we endure, all these different things, like they are unique, but they're also universal. And I think that that's the thing that is also one of the defining characteristics of a really skilled poet, is being able to like kind of balance between universality and these very like specific like unique experiences, and engaging with these broader themes. And so I think that that's captured very effectively like in your work. And another aspect of your writing that's wonderful to me is like how it you shift back and forth, I think, with like how you use lines like in your poems. And that's there's a dynamism there. So I was actually not familiar with the form that the
mm,
duplex form. For our listeners, it's the poem's comprised of tight, heavily enjambed couplets, and then by contrast, your poem Mexican Superstition, which was published elsewhere, has these longer lines that are sewn together by slashes. And you know I like that you were able to find a lot of versatility, like kind of moving back and forth between like these different forms. And I was wondering, do you find yourself gravitating towards a particular form before you start, or does it just kind of unfold as you go?
Yeah, I love this question because I finally have an answer out of like the decade long of like me studying poetry. Um, I should say my decade long love affair with poetry. I finally kind of landed on prose block.
Mm,
And I was kind of stuck there for a while, and it just felt confined, but also like in a comforting box way.
mm-hmm.
It's visually a prose block on the page. Um, yeah, and I have several poems that represent that. And but as of late, also like in order to break a writing block, like pun unintended, I started experimenting with other forms. I've never considered myself a formalist. I was always
Mm-hmm.
kind of just like a free agent in that sense. But forms to me, when there's a little bit of restriction, you
Mm-hmm.
have to find other avenues of creativity. So I ended up writing a crown sonnet.
Mm-hmm.
And for folks that are listening and aren't familiar with crown sonnets, it's basically sonnet, like a sonnet, a 14 line sonnet, and then it's a sequence, and then the consecutive sonnet will repeat the last line as its first line, and then and forming the crown.
Mm-hmm.
And then so you end up with, I believe, like 14 or 15 sonnets that like circle back on each other. And it's the longest poem I've ever written. Honestly, it's about 5 pages long. And I've really restricted myself also to 10 syllables per line. But it was super fun to write. And I had an experience that I wanted to talk about, again, like stretching out a certain scene, and in this case a certain summer, and my experience of actually moving to Los Angeles. So I had a lot to work with, a lot of material, a lot of lived experience to work with. So it ended up really, that form really ended up lending itself to that content. And I was kind of terrified of finishing it because I didn't know how I was gonna close out the loop. And because it was such a constricted form with like the 10 syllables per line. And then I hate to say this again, but that poem like damn near like wrote itself, because I was just sitting here like, okay, I had the image, I had the narrative, and then I typed out the last line, which was like, looking at Hollywood through my window. And that's not the exact quote, but it ended up being 10 syllables. And I was just like, oh, thank baby Jesus, like it's 10 syllables. And that form, I mean, I don't know if I'll ever attempt that form again. It was pretty rigorous. And I found it through another poet friend, like that wrote a little tiny like chapbook.
Mm-hmm.
And that crown sonnet, it's individual sonnets on each page. So, and they each have a title. Mine is just one long like sequence.
Mm-hmm.
So again, I'm influenced by my peers, and I think I'll always go back to a prose block because again, like it's just some kind of a form of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And the flashes, I'm not really sure like where those come from. I think it's just like my days as I was really into like slam and like performance and also like beat poetry. So I those flashes just kind of represent um kind of like just the rhythm and the pace that I want, like when I'm performing the piece. So
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to translate onto the page for the reader. But I think you can kind of just insert those into any form.
Mm-hmm.
And like I think a poem. I always hated when my teacher said this, but it's so true that the poem is going to do what the poem wants to do. And
Mm-hmm.
and then like you can mess with it. I've taken my prose block apart and then just putting them back together. I've taken various other forms and then just putting them into the prose block, and then it just looks so nice on the page that and then that's when I know like this is finished because it clicks.
Mm-hmm.
And then that's how I know that that's the form that it wants.
Yeah. And I'm glad that you mentioned that crown sonnet sequence and stuff. I have, for our listeners, I have been fortunate enough to hear you read it in
Mm.
person, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a wildly complex poem
Mm-hmm.
that kind of just like it unfolds in a way that it just feels like something unspooling, like a ribbon
Mm.
unspooling, and it has this really really wonderful rhythm to it. And so if anyone ever has the opportunity to go hear Karla read, you shout out the crown sonnet and stuff, and
Thank
encourage
you.
the reading of it.
Yeah, I mean, that poem is 10 minutes long, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to read anything else unless it's
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
But going back to the prose block, I started, I'm in the school of thought where like the form almost, I know there is a philosophy for the prose block,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm also thinking that like I don't necessarily want to distract a reader with a form.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
like yes, it's on the page, etc. We already, visually we already talked about it, but I'm really keen on just the words on the page without necessarily telling the reader when to pause because there's a line break. That's just kind of me forming like my own little philosophy about it. But I mean, a reader's gonna do whatever a reader wants.
Totally,
Um,
totally.
yeah.
Yeah, I like those poems where I've also seen a poet will use slashes, and then it looks like it was a prose block, but then they'll end up taking words out and stuff, so it creates this really
Mhm.
odd, I don't even know how to describe it, like kind of like a Morse code or something like that kind of
Sure.
thing and stuff, where it creates this like
Mhm.
wholly different aspect of use of language in a way that visually it's very very interesting to me. And so like I like the use of punctuation for that point.
There's also like erasure.
Yeah, but like it there's an erasure component to it, but I think it's
Yeah.
also the fact that like there's that punctuation is incorporated in such a way that it creates this like almost like a whole new design.
Hmm.
And not when I oftentimes when I think of erasure, I think of like the large like blacking out of text and
Yeah.
stuff, you know, like doing that and stuff. Whereas like this, I feel like it's like almost incorporating the punctuation in such a way that like that it becomes its own element within the poem. And like it's not only assisting with like how the poem is read, but then also like just yeah, it's like creating almost this like kind of sculpture, like this like texture and
Hmm.
stuff that's kind of cool. So I wanted to circle back to another important thread that I think runs through your work, and that's your connection to the body. Your poems have, you know, it's a deep thread. I, you know, especially I think of like your poem Incision, which is a very visceral poem. It's a powerful poem about bodily autonomy. It is a, you know, it has these incredible inflection points. And I just, you know, I wanted to see if you could kind of elaborate more about the importance of the body in your writing, not just as a symbol, but also like writing from the body, and like kind of like how what that means to you as a poet.
Wow. Yeah. Writing from the body. I mean, it all really kind of goes back to writing our own experiences, right? So the body is such a frustrating thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's weird, it's sexualized, it's objectified, it's um, but then it's also like powerful and beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
And when it comes to like me writing about the body, honestly, as of late, I don't. I was about to say I've moved away from writing about it specifically,
Mm-hmm.
but I've come to think of it, I mean, my recent poems are about like relationships and
Mm-hmm.
like sex and like passion and things like that. But that poem that you referred to, Incision, yeah, again, it me like working out something that like happened to me, you
Mm-hmm.
know,
Mm-hmm.
like working it out on the page. I'm not sure if I fully have like an answer that the poetry community might find it lazy, but it's just like I love and hate my body all at the same
Mm-hmm.
time, like the complicated relationship that I personally have with my own body. I think my body betrays me a lot of the time, but at the same time I'm okay with it. And I don't know, I think my relationship could be healthier probably with my body, but that's just me being socialized in this day and age.
Mm-hmm.
I think it just has to be with it has to do with like being a woman, I
Mm-hmm.
think, or identifying as a woman and like female experiences when it comes to like growing up and those formative years and like that poem specifically, just so I can like speak on it more freely. Incision is about a breast reduction,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and now come to think of it, I have other poems that have to do with abortion, and a lot of I've had people interpret those poems as like sexual assault. And like I don't ever explicitly say like abortion in the poem. It's
Mm-hmm.
poetic. It's a piece of art. Like I'm not gonna title it like, oh, abortion. I don't know, it's just like my own like poetic license slash choice,
Sure.
as the maker. But again, I think it has to do with the importance of expressing these things, of getting it out of my body, because obviously the body remembers.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it has to do with healing, and like it's therapeutic. And poetry has like the many uses of poetry in the world. Obviously it's going to be someone else's coping, someone else's representation, someone else's therapy.
Sure.
And I think that's my impetus for writing up from about my body, from within my body. Like firstly, I want to get it out.
Mm-hmm.
Secondly, I want to share,
Mm-hmm.
and I want to, and I hate to, for lack of a better word, like help women, like
Mm-hmm.
help women see themselves as like, first of all, like not alone, and as beautiful, and as like it's okay, you did nothing wrong.
Mm-hmm.
um and then yeah, like I was relatively young um when I had a breast reduction, so I I didn't write about it for many years.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time I didn't even know, I didn't really understand.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
I think that poem came out of like curiosity, right? Like what like not that it happened to me necessarily, but I did. It's very much my voice. Like I
Mm-hmm.
am the speaker, and that
Mm-hmm.
was something else, right? Like how how do I detach myself as the poet versus the speaker? And I'm very okay with saying like, oh no, yeah, I am the speaker. In a
Mm-hmm.
lot, in the abortion poem, in the poem about like dating this man, in the poem about an abortion, like that's me. um
Absolutely.
and I'm more and more like very much okay with that. And like yeah, these poems define me, and this goes back to your question about identity, right? Like as who I am, like who, like the expression, like I am like female bodied, queer, like these things are all very political, and then innately like these poems are political. But I want the question of the body, and I think perhaps like in the future I'll go back to writing about the body, because a lot of the time, like, or like in my life right now, and like these poems don't exist yet, but I'm going through like some health difficulties.
Mm.
And so without saying too much, like, and I'll probably just spill it all in the poems as I usually do, so just wait for that. Yeah, relationships with body, it's just a very very complex like thing to write about.
Mm-hmm.
But I think just from the poems that already exist in the world, I just think it's important to do
Yeah.
so.
Yeah. I
Mhm.
mean, that poem in particular, I mean, you do such a great job of balancing out these very heavy subjects in terms
Mhm.
of hypersexualization, the objectification of the
Mhm.
female body, the violence
Yeah.
like perpetrated on women, and femme presenting individuals, and it's a and you also talk about the connection to motherhood, about there's a lot of these different aspects, and I appreciate it because it forces someone like me out of out of I think, and again, this is a kind of quality of really good poetry, is that like it forces you out of comfort zones and forces you to like engage and wrestle with very heavy topics, but in a way that I what I love about poetry, that can draw you in and do something very subtly, and then like all of a sudden you feel like you just you had like an anvil dropped on your head, and then like you have to
Mhm.
kind of come back and like reread and like re-explore, and it's such
Mhm.
a it is a very visceral poem, but it's very beautiful, and like and I love how it engages with bodily autonomy, and like
Mhm.
there's a lot of like really great aspects of it. That's all to say that just it embodies so much, and I know I struggle writing from or writing about the body. I think I typically write from my head,
Mm,
and that, and that has its own traps, and it's a very 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 much like an echo chamber. And so and I
yeah.
think there's something about writing like from, from like kind of like lower down in your,
Mhm.
in your body, and like bringing it out and stuff, that like it's like you almost have like this gravity there, this, this like kind of anchor and stuff, that's like that there's more connection and stuff.
It's so interesting, right? Like I've heard a lot of people say like, "Oh, I'm feeling a little bit out of body," and
Mm-hmm.
it's like they could just be saying that about anything, or like if they're too stressed, or didn't get enough sleep, or whatever, what have you, in their life experience or the day to day. But that little turn of phrase like has been having like a different meaning, or like has been gaining a different meaning to me in my head.
Mm.
um like I feel like I'm always in my body, so like
Mm.
because of chronic illness and like being somebody in a female body that like bleeds, so like
Mm-hmm.
I'm always kind of just like, oh, there's a pain, oh, there's a thing, like I'm
Mm-hmm.
in my body like constantly like assessing like, oh, what's that weird bump, oh, I have a thing now, like I'm always just like in my body, but it's also in my mind. And the next time I sit down like to write, I'm gonna really assess like those two differences, because right,
Mm.
like, when you're talking about like writing from your head, like yeah, a lot of the times I am kind of writing to, again, just like kind of figure out or cope with an experience,
Mm-hmm.
probably because of my head, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
because of
Mm-hmm.
what I perceived
Mm-hmm.
or what I went through. And it's just, yeah, like the body always kind of comes through regardless
Yeah.
in my work.
Yeah. Obviously, Jericho Brown has been a really important influence on your work.
Yeah.
And we talked about Sarah Borjas at the top. And what is it about his work that has been so essential to you? And I guess along those lines, are there other poets that you find yourself coming back to, where you're like, these are people that I'm thinking about, for either for your own subject matter, or, perhaps techniques that you employ in your writing?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, Jericho Brown, if the listeners have ever get a chance to see him live, it's just one of the most transformative like performances, and right up there with like Ross Gay and a lot of poets that are, I think that they're also like professors, right? So they're
Mm-hmm.
very used to like public speaking. But Jericho Brown specifically, like his voice, like what it's like he gets into this like character almost. And I am on stage at least once or twice a month, and
Mm-hmm.
I've been noticing how like on stage I kind of black out. Like I don't know what just happened. I don't know what I just said. I know I'm reading it from the page. I know that I'm performing. I know that like I did a relatively maybe good job, or like I didn't mess up or mispronounce a thing, or like, but I like I do feel like I change, like I shift into this
Mm-hmm.
other click, like I'm somebody different on stage, because I'm like introvert extrovert from page to stage kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, Jericho Brown, when I was exposed to his work in college, in grad school, I was lucky enough to like work with him when I was working at City of Asylum in Pittsburgh, and just an amazing, like his voice is like whispery and like intense, and like you really have to pay attention because those words are honest, just so um he uses a lot of like sound, right, in
Mm-hmm.
his work, and they're just like like they're like waves just like coming at you, like just
Mm-hmm.
slapping you in the face, and like image after image after, it's an intense roller coaster.
Mm-hmm.
And I do try to imitate that. And poets that I come back to, Olena Olena Davis is
Mm-hmm.
one that I think is underrated. I think
Mm-hmm.
she's also a lawyer. I think she lives in Alaska. I
Hmm.
have three of her books, but like nobody that I necessarily, I don't even know how I discovered her years ago. Is just like these poems are just so, they're just so like abstract, I want to say
Mm-hmm.
too. Like
Mm-hmm.
she breaks a lot of rules, but they're also like just profoundly fresh
Yeah.
as far as like word choice is concerned. And they're very modern. They talk about like motherhood and like love, and like one of the images that comes to mind, like she's the speaker is describing and it's a lyric poem, so it's the I statements that repeat, and she's
Mm-hmm.
like, I am driving my truck, like it's these poems are very much accessible too, so I try to I'm always erring on the side of like not being too verbose or too heady in my work. And that was something that as I developed my voice, I definitely strayed away from being like too intellectual in my work. Like I definitely wanted to be of the people for the people, if
Mm-hmm.
that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I think Jericho Brown does that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm trying to think, like Sandra Cisneros has always been like a strong influence on my work. Let's see, Natalie Diaz,
Mm-hmm.
also when she performs, is just so, I don't know, without being too dramatic, it's honestly just like a stab in the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I mean, I think people can look up these poets on YouTube, and there's plenty of material out there of them performing. But yeah, Natalie Diaz is somebody that I constantly come back to. Post-colonial love poem, I think, is her second book, and it's just yeah, talking about indigenous experiences, talking about environmental issues and how like water as a human right. Um, and these poems are just so like not only evocative in the poetic sense, but just the humanity, the
Mm-hmm.
humanity within those pieces, and like contained and like restrained in those pieces. Um, Stevie Edwards,
Mm-hmm.
an amazing poet as well. And these are folks that I discovered kind of young in my writing. And I don't know, I've never get rid of books. And I in Mexico, there's a saying like, oh, let me see if I can translate this on the spot. Kind of just saying like, you're you're a dummy if you lend a book, and you're a dummy if you give it back. So um, I never lend my books. And if there's been like two friends that I'm like, okay, like these are my prized
Uh,
possessions. And I literally write it down, and I'm like, I'm gonna hit you back for these books. And like, sure enough, like I have my books back. But yeah, I've always grown up like both my parents are pretty literary, so
mm-hmm.
I've always grown up with like my mom being really creative. My dad was a professor for a long time, and both of them are just like, mm-mm, never, ever, ever lend your books. And that's honestly also how I started. I was a only child for a very long time, and I was just like rummaging through my parents' bookshelves, and I was like, oh, what is this? I'm trying to think of the first book of theirs that I kind of took. I don't know, but I do remember finding like their love letters as bookmarks, and
Mm-hmm.
they're both like romantic. So like I think that's just how it must just be genetic.
That's cool. That's
The
really
creative gene. I'm
cool.
not sure if that answered your question,
No,
but
no, that's great. I mean, I like the literary qualities of like our family and stuff. Like for me, it's like my mom wrote all these like little notes and stuff, and like there's all this like kind of marginalia that she has, and so I think that those things, I didn't realize like how similar she was in terms of like how she thinks and or like how she thought and everything, and so it's like now it's like I'm able to draw these lines to to how she works, and so it's like it's not only the poets that I actively seek out to read and find influence from, but I also have been able to like kind of draw this important like through line to like my mom's own writing and like kind of thinking. So um I asked this of the poet Joe Milazzo, and I wanted to ask you this as well. But how has place affected your writing? Because you were living in Pittsburgh for a while, and
yeah.
then like me, you're kind of more of a recent transplant to Los Angeles, and I guess like how has the change in locale like affected your work?
Yeah, this is also a great question that I like because I have an answer to it now. Oh wow, where to start? I never thought that a place would really influence my work. I
Mm-hmm.
always just thought that it would be like, oh, my life experiences, my heartbreaks, my breakups, my, you know. But LA has just found its way into my poetry without even asking. and I'm going on, I want to say 3.5 years. I did grow up here as a kid, moved away for a long time. I came back every summer, maybe twice a year sometimes.
Mm.
Have family here. But as an adult living in LA, after like Midwest and East Coast life, it's just so different. Yeah, my horizons expanded, my comfort, like as a, I don't know, just like living. I don't know how to, without getting like too, I guess, personal, which is so weird to say, but like LA has presented like a series of challenges
Mm.
that like no other city has necessarily presented, right? But also it's so like the highways, the sunsets, like these images are so evocative, and obviously the ocean. Um and I don't, again, like I don't really sit here and think of like, oh, I'm gonna write a poem about LA. It
Right.
just happened,
Yeah.
which is so weird. And it's again like weird to me, like, we were talking earlier about identity. Like I'm very proud to have been like born and raised in Mexico City. And Mexico finds its way into my poems when I'm writing about heritage, when I'm writing again about identity and kind of like political corruption that happens in
Mm-hmm.
Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
and immigration. A lot of my family immigrated. And then, yeah, the duality of being uprooted, and like being bicultural, bilingual. That's when Mexico finds its way into my work. Um, Another thing a professor told me a long time ago was like, don't write what you know, like, write what you don't know, actually. And I was
Hmm.
feeling really disconnected from Mexico because I'm fully Americanized. Like, my
Mm-hmm.
accent is gone. I'm a nationalized citizen. Like, I mean, I want to be more involved in like Mexican politics, but I never voted there before. I've only
Mm-hmm.
ever voted here. And so I was writing what I didn't know, and
Mm-hmm.
like this disconnection that I was feeling. But then I feel very connected to LA, and almost like I wouldn't have, like, yes, of course I miss Pittsburgh and the life that I had there, and I sacrificed a lot to be here. But I don't think I would ever go back because I honestly kind of hit a ceiling and I hit this plateau, and like I wasn't growing as a person and much less as
Mm-hmm.
a poet.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the 3.5 years I've been here, I would say maybe 10 to 15 poems that are just like some of my best work. And that's
Mm-hmm.
honestly worth it.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
worth the heartache and the sacrifice. I'm really grateful for like the experiences I did have elsewhere, but LA has just slapped me in the face and like slapped me with a bunch of like reality and like
Yeah.
realness and
Yeah.
like again, authenticity and like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like so gritty and cutthroat. I don't know what it is about me necessarily. Like I'm social and like personable, and I try to be mean and mysterious, but that just doesn't work for me. Like I want to be like that person like you see on the street, like, oh, like so intimidating, but I'm really not. Like I
Mm-hmm.
don't know why, what it is about me that I want to be that, but
Mm-hmm.
I think again it's like this persona, right? This like coping. And I've been introduced by another friend of mine who's also a performer, like just like at a party, and she introduced me as like, oh, this is Karla. Like she's not as intimidating as she looks. And I was like, oh God, like I want to be intimidating though. And that's just for because it's LA and because
Yeah.
like we're so concerned of like looks and appearances and like status. But those kind of concepts do find their way into my work. But it's more about like I think I'm really interested in like the mannequins that I see with like the Adidas like counterfeit tracksuits
Mm-hmm.
in East Hollywood, like in my neighborhood, and like the abuelitas that I see, like people that it reminds me so much of Mexico and like the
Mm-hmm.
like Little Tokyo, Thai Town, like these places that are not anywhere else. It's just
Yeah.
so beautiful, and I want to capture that,
Yeah.
and I also really love when people say like, "Oh, that's just such an LA thing." I saw like on my street like a guy with like a kitty on his backpack, like
Mm-hmm.
not even a kitty, like a kitty in a backpack, like just on his shoulders, and he
Yeah.
was like, I don't know, like on a unicycle, and I was just like where am I?
Right.
And I
Right.
do like I want people to see that, and if I can capture that, like I'm glad I can.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, it's interesting. I had a friend of my brother's when we first moved up here. He, was like, "Oh, how are you guys doing since you moved here?" And we're like, "Yeah, it's cool. Like, we liked it." And he's like, "Okay." He's like, I thought at the time he was kind of trying to be funny, but he was being deadly serious, and he was like, "Yeah." He's like, "First 2, 3 years here, they're hard. Like if
Yeah,
you get like you gotta get it's kind of like the city's hazing you, and then
yeah.
if you make it through that, you're okay. Like you'll be fine. And it's hard. Like living in Los Angeles is no joke. It's not easy, and
Ooh, yeah.
I still wrestle with it a lot. Um,
Before we move on though,
yeah, yeah,
I do want to dismantle, like I don't necessarily subscribe to like, oh, LA is gonna spit you out type of thing. I do want to dismantle that kind of mentality because I don't want to dissuade people from coming here.
sure,
Granted, we're, overpopulated, but if anybody listening like wants to pursue that life, yes, please,
yeah,
And I was lucky enough to already have family here and
yeah,
already have somewhere to land, but I don't fully subscribe to like that mentality of like fake it till you make it type of
yeah.
mentality. Like I think that's really toxic, and I personally don't live like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I've met incredible people here so far, and I've had incredible experiences, and yeah, like wild opportunities I never thought I would have. And yeah, like again, incredible people, talented, authentic people, and it's not all fake.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
disclaimer.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, as I've been invoking Whitman throughout this, the city contains
Mm,
multitudes.
yeah.
There's so many different walks of life. I wanted to end on, in addition to being a poet, you are a curator and run the highly successful poetry showcase and open mic Verse for Verse, and its most recent incarnation, Perverse for Verse, which
Yes.
which I saw, and I was really bummed that I had another event to go to that night because it looked like it was amazing and a lot of fun. And can you talk about how just to kind of end things, like just how does your role as a curator and a community organizer, like how does that influence your work as a poet?
Well, first of all, it keeps me on my feet. It keeps me creative. It keeps me accountable. Like I want to write something new for each installment. It's crazy. That's a lot of pressure to like put on myself.
Yeah, yeah.
For a while there, I did have a new poem every month, but
Uh-huh.
then I met someone and then I kind of got distracted. And what I decided to do instead of like, yeah, it's my show and I can do whatever I want is kind of like my tagline. But what in lieu of reading an original piece, I started kind of just bringing to the table like other people's work.
Mm-hmm.
I brought a Natalie Diaz poem. I brought like some underrated poets and underrepresented folks that honestly that maybe like a quick Google search, people that fit the theme, and then I would bring those to the table, right? Like I would and like just perform them and then tell everyone like, oh, follow such and such person.
Mm-hmm.
um and that's kind of like my role as a curator, a community organizer, just empowering and uplifting folks like me, like
Yeah.
folks that are kind of like swimming against the current and that want to see themselves on stage. Like Verse for Verse is an open mic, and I like baby poets, open micers, or aka baby poets. I know it takes a lot of guts to like, get behind a mic and spit notes at poems and queer poems and unfinished poems, and it keeps so many people have come up to me after the open mic and just said like, yeah, thank you for
Mm-hmm.
not only this platform, but also again, it serves a purpose of keeping people creative because they
Mm-hmm.
want to bring something new. It's such an amazing community. I really love doing it. Like love of the game. Um, Verse for Verse is just an amazing gift that it's reciprocal, right? Like it's a
Mm-hmm.
gift to me, it's a gift to the community, and it is like a queer expansive open mic. And I always say that like queer people have a lot to say,
Yeah.
and it's true. And like me being one of them. I have, I don't think I can ever like necessarily shut up. So like thank you again for this opportunity, this platform, and like once you get me going. But yeah, like it doesn't necessarily, as far as like structure, it only keeps me like creative, like, oh, I have to like be on point. Like
Yeah.
I have to write the script, I have to curate the show.
Yeah.
I have to keep my finger on the pulse of like who's up and coming.
Yeah.
I want to give people a platform. So a lot of the featured poets, like, yeah, they're published people with books and like individual poems, and those are the movers and shakers in a queer literary circle.
Yeah.
But I've expanded to other folks that, again, like that don't have book deals
Yeah.
and that aren't necessarily getting published. um and yeah, I'm not sure the event itself influences my work necessarily. It definitely keeps me busy, so it might even do the opposite. I have less time to write, but only the impetus or like the impulse, right? Like I want to bring something new, I want to be able to perform something new. But
Mm-hmm.
a month is a very short period of time to incubate a poem, to come up with it, to write it, to edit it, and then to perform it is like fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Um, I've allowed myself to bring other people's work to that stage.
Mm-hmm.
It's coming up to, we just changed venues and we had an excellent turnout. And Perverse for Verse was only really for October because October is National Kink Month, and it was really fun to have that theme. I've never been like, for my events, I don't usually like impose a theme, but it worked really well.
Mm-hmm.
And to go back, like people brought it, like they brought the outfits, they brought the sexy spicy poems, and it was definitely, a spicy night. But I
Yeah.
my friends and I were kind of joking, like it was also like kind of tame for the kink community but spicy for the poetry community, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
um and so yeah, perverse, it was a huge success, and thank you Heavy Manners for hosting us. I'm really looking forward to working with them again. It's really interesting. Like, I'm trying to think of a kind of like a poetry workshop for adults. Um, Also in that space, I'm also teaching seventh and eighth graders poetry once a week.
Oh wow.
And
Oh, that's really cool.
that's another opportunity. And that all happened in like one day. Like in the morning I was with seventh graders, and at night I was hosting a spicy poetry reading, which is
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so LA of me, right?
Yeah.
Like, so like these stories that and these experiences that wouldn't necessarily happen anywhere else to anyone else. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
in a month or two, when that whole experience like processes through my psyche and through my body, like it'll finally, manifest on the page. Because it is kind of fun to kind of look back and explore, like, yeah, how did I feel, like that roller coaster of emotions, and like
Totally.
what all went down that specific day and time, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I do eventually want to write about it, and it'll be pretty meta if one day I bring that to the stage.
That's cool.
um which is all part of the fun of it all.
Yeah. Yeah. Lastly, can you let our listeners know where they can find more about you and your work and everything else?
Yeah, sure. I post all the interviews and all the publications on my Instagram, which is at Vinyl Owl. I don't collect vinyl, sorry. But it is VINYLOWL. That's where you'll find all the things. And my website is going through a little renovation right now, but it's just my name, karlalamb.com. Yeah, you can find me in LA. You can find me in at Stories Bookstore, at Heavy Manners, at any, not all, but most of the queer parties that are
Mm-hmm.
happening. Trying to like lay low this month, but I do like to go out. Let's talk poetry. Let's talk queer poetry. And yeah, this has been so lovely and fun.
Well, Karla, this has been great. Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence, and I really enjoyed our conversation. And Yes, to all listeners out there, please, if you happen to run into Karla, or if you know about an event that she is either reading and performing at, or she's organizing, go, because it's definitely worth it. It's awesome. So, all right, we will talk soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This has
Yeah.
been so great, and we'll talk soon.
Okay.
Bye.
All right, Joe Milazzo, welcome to the Broken Lens podcast. We're so glad to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be here, wherever here is actually.
On that note, I'd like to have you read Last Known Address.
Sure. Last known address. A scrub at the blonde rings, trapped within the rosewood lacquer of the piano's most furniture-like obverses, and ponder the thrum in the untidiness between number and pattern. As light remembers again its ubiquity, growths too raw to know where increase leads compete to reach an all-consuming sun. The window, the clouds, the wires, drawing uneventful seismograms in the blank spaces above dwelling with their long, busy bodies all frame this surfeit of tempos for me. Come evening, a wrap. Only faces, not shapes, may be strangers, from rough figures waiting to be conveyed or received by cognizance. Sisters and brothers step forward. Come in and sit down and ply the adjacent mysteries I let slip through my limitations when smallness spelled my possibilities grandly in letters both blocky and unsteady. Come be young, not once more, but only for as long as that time that passes more gently than the past. Break up the day, for it cannot claim to have sung anything.
Love it. Your lyricism has a deftness and lightness that reminds me of a dancer, but it would be like a dancer moving gracefully across rough spaces, like a ballet and like a dilapidated steel mill. Um, and a lot of your writing, you use to great effect using pastiche and juxtaposition to kind of create these startling contrasts that highlight these larger existential questions about ephemerality, nostalgia, corrosion. And I was just wondering if you could, kind of talk about your writing process more, and how does assemblage and pastiche and some of those tools like play into your writing process?
That's a great question. I think for me, one of the attractions of writing from a very early age or stage in being a writer, however you want to think about that, was the possibility of sort of moving into different spaces associated with specific discourses, right? So each discourse is its own kind of terrain, it's its own kind of consciousness.
Mm-hmm.
That's one reason why I was interested in being a fiction writer early on. If I have training, it's mostly as a novelist. So, I'm always trying to stay attuned to the language and the materiality of the language, which is partly sound and texture and those things that are sensory qualities of language, but also the social context that comes with them.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the idea of in a small space like a poem of having, those different contexts superimposed on each other, overlapping, interpenetrating in conversation with each other. So yeah, that's something that I'm often looking for in my writing is to kind of be able to move between different discourses and bring different discourses together to hear how they can possibly speak to one another
Mm-hmm.
and bring more meaning out of each other, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's also interesting that you bring up kind of your work as a novelist. That reminds me of my good friend and one of our contributors, Mark Wallace and stuff, who also
Mhm.
has a lot of interplay between his work as a novelist and as a poet, and how the two feed each other. And I do want to get to that later. I also, you write kind of short, terse lyrics that have like a almost like a William-esque quality to them. But it's more like if Williams had been into like hardcore punk rock and skateboarding, and I kind of wonder, like, can you talk about shifting between these longer works and the shorter ones? Do you go in with the intention of writing, shorter pieces versus longer ones, or does the length kind of dictate itself as the writing and the editing process unfolds?
I think there are two answers to that question. The first answer is the answer that I like to tell myself. I don't know if it's entirely true, but it's an answer I've told myself for a long time, which is, and I think it's mostly true. I really look for the form to kind of emerge and reveal itself to me. So I don't typically go in with an idea that something is going to have a particular form. I think for me, a good example of that was the habiliments.
Mm,
Those started as very short poems, and I think I kind of challenged myself to write something short because that's not necessarily my default.
mm-hmm.
I wanted it to, over time, I started to see something emerge from it that, yeah, that to me, that's just a good example of the form revealing itself to me as I wrote more of those, and it sort of had an accumulative effect. And the constraints that guided that work came out of what I saw in the early batch of work that I did. The other answer I kind of alluded to, which is that I actually kind of tend toward maximalism and excess, I think,
Mm-hmm.
to a degree. And I've certainly written work where that's part of the point, partly because I'm a contrarian at heart, and I don't see a lot of that work. I would
Mm-hmm.
say that I'm also of a generation that came to literature at a time when postmodernism in American lit took a particular form, and maximalism was part of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's just part of my frame of reference for a certain kind of experimental writing, I guess. I don't accept that just, without questioning, but to me, sort of working through questions of how far can you push something? What's the point at which an overabundance of whatever detail, description, language, pleasure
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
tips the work over into something else? To me, that also gets into some of my interest in improvisation and just kind of saying yes to things and letting them
Yeah.
kind of go where they're going to go. I feel like my work, each thing that I work on, each project, for lack of a better term, I guess they're all, I'm not a good judge of this. I think other people could tell me. To me, they all feel very different,
Mm-hmm.
guided by different sets of concerns. And it's like, wait, who am I as a
Yeah.
writer?
Yeah.
And I'm okay with that. I think that that's not for everyone.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in, I guess it's also a reflection of my taste in other work by other artists. Like I'm very much drawn to the work of artists who were very much about reinvention and pushing themselves. Miles Davis is a good example.
Mm-hmm.
Philip Guston is another good example. They were very restless. And there's a through line in their work for sure. Like you always know you're listening to Miles Davis or you're looking at something that Philip Guston drew or painted.
Yeah.
But the express, they are not going to settle for a particular style
Mm-hmm.
that is strongly associated with them. So I've probably tried to emulate that more than not.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I'm curious about the comment you had about like the maximalism, and
Mhm.
is that something that you feel is almost distinctly American? Because I feel like I haven't necessarily seen the level of like maximalism like replicated in poetry that's coming out of other languages, and especially in certain countries, apart from maybe some of the work that the surrealists did, like the French surrealists,
Mhm.
and some of the density of their language and their language games, and same thing with Oulipo, and
Mhm.
I wonder, is there kind of a distinct like American maximalism that like is unique to our, to our literary culture and stuff here, as opposed to other places where I've seen more, like, I think of Scandinavian poets, who
Hmm.
tend to write much more sparingly, and, like, but still are very good at homing in on surreal language, or, the late Charles Simic, like his very terse lyrics that he wrote, but he was very good at creating these very unsettling, images and juxtapositions. So I'd be curious about that, about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a strain of American poetry, starting with Whitman, you know, uh, very maximalist. You have Olson,
Mm-hmm.
in the modern era, even Pound, which I don't know, Pound is not get into Pound for lots of different reasons, but it is. I mean, the cantos are
Mm-hmm.
huge, right?
Yeah, yeah. And Olson is a great example because of I mean, it's in the title, in the Maximus
Yeah,
poem.
Maximus,
So
right?
yeah,
But even
yeah.
somebody like Jack Spicer and some of the
Mm.
beats, were there's an expansiveness to that
Mm-hmm.
work. And the language poets, I think also there are certain language poets that sort of tend toward the maximal. I mean, certainly the volume of work
Mm-hmm.
scale.
Yeah.
Um, I don't know. It's kind of hard to say. I mean, it really, I tend to think of it from poet to poet. I mean, you could say Neruda is a kind of maximalist,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
and he was certainly someone who, oh, here's another form I can do something with. And, I would say some of the contemporary South American poets, Kim Hae-soon, there's a kind of maximalist or excessive element to what they're doing.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the necropastoral work, as it's sort of been umbrellaed by Joelle McSweeney, and there's a tinge toward a kind of unruliness. I mean, Alice Knowley is another sort of maximalist
Yeah.
writer. The books seem to be getting bigger from
Yeah.
Alice Notley, as a matter of fact, which is pretty interesting. But I think that I'm kind of interested in the maximalist impulse in a way, because it feels to me, and I could be mistaking things, but it feels to me that the prevailing aesthetic is more toward the spare and
Mm.
the controlled. And I'm interested in, there are good reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a time and a place for that. But what happens when you start to go against that grain?
Yeah.
And some subjects to me seem like they maybe would benefit from that approach more than the other
Mm-hmm.
prevailing
Mm-hmm.
approach, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But that doesn't, yeah, I mean, I think that creates a different kind of challenge for some readers
Yeah.
when you go big, for
Yeah.
lack of a better term.
Absolutely. But and then there's, it's interesting because when I think of, if I do think of a contrarian, like a person that was writing very much in a minimal style, was like Sid Corman at the time that, like, Charles Olson was
Yeah,
doing the Maximus poems. And so, and Corman's lines are so, I mean, you can read an entire book of his in a very short stretch of time, but you really can't, because there's so much meaning, like, condensed into these really
right.
terse, like, very heavily jammed poems. And so you
Hmm.
have to reread them, like, multiple times to be able to kind of decipher them. And so I like that in some ways. I guess, to your point, there is almost like, even though the poems themselves and execution are minimal, there is like a maximalist, like, element to, like, to the meaning, and, like, to the kind of the energy that's present, like, in the writing.
Yeah. Do you know Robert Lax? He was a poet who moved to a remote Greek island, an American poet.
Yes,
Lots of
yes.
repetition. So the poems are
Mm-hmm.
both small scale
Yes.
and expansive at the same time. But another poet like this is Ray Johnson. So Arc, and even his last work, The
Mm-hmm.
Shrubberies and The Green Man. So small units that he builds up a bunch of little small. I mean, Arc is an amazing book because it's very
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
architectural, and it's like he's actually trying to build a spaceship,
Yes.
like almost.
Yeah.
I think it's wonderful that we have all these different models out there for
Mm-hmm.
us, and the question of minimalist, maximalist, conceptual, whatever the opposite of conceptual, like those distinctions all start to break down
Yeah.
when you get into like truly imaginative work.
And I like the idea of like the fact that the umbrella terms. I was listening to, I don't know if you listened to the podcast Gray Area with Sean Illing, but like
Hmm.
he had this incredible philosopher on, and unfortunately her name's escaping me, about but they had a discussion about black existentialism,
Mm.
and one of her things, it was just a side comment, but she was saying that as philosophers they need to create taxonomies, because otherwise if they don't have a taxonomy it kind of loses its bearing.
Yeah.
But I like in the context of poetry where someone is existing outside of a taxonomy, like where they are like their own individual element and kind of floating out in like in the ether a little bit. Like Clark Coolidge kind of feels like that to me,
Oh yeah.
and you know, and so and I love that where it's like you can't really lump them with anyone. Like they're really a very distinctive person. Same thing with like Will Alexander. Like he
Hmm.
operates on like a whole other frequency.
There's a maximalist.
Yes, yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
and Aaron Coonan is another writer who
Mm-hmm.
is kind of in between, use of repetition and also like, let me push the constraint like past the point of breaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the taxonomy question is super interesting. I'm of a generation where we resisted labels as much as possible, like in all
Mm-hmm.
aspects of life. I don't know that that same value is as prevalent in the
Mm-hmm.
culture as it once was, and I'm not going to judge that. I'm going to remark on it as a sort of interesting thing that I have observed change in the course of
Yeah.
my life.
Yeah.
So sometimes it feels like divided by a common
Yeah.
language a bit when you start talking about aesthetics and the ethics
Yes.
that come
Yes.
along with it. And yeah, it's just it makes it a more interesting time to be alive.
Yeah. I had a roommate during college. He had a very close friend of his who they were both visual artists, and one of them I remember saying was like, as soon as you can label the scene, then the scene's dead. So so the school is over. So at that point,
But
but
also from a perspective as a writer,
mm-hmm.
like you need that name, you need that handle, you need that thing to grab onto and have a quick reference so that,
Yes,
again, I say it and everybody knows the social phenomenon that I'm referring to, and
right, right,
they can bring that in, and then it's just points to again like what a complicated, strange phenomenon language is,
yes,
you know,
yes. I
uh,
agree.
which is what it makes it interesting as an artistic material to
I
me.
agree. I agree. Um, on that note, I also find, you know, your writing has a wonderful absurdist quality to it, and there's a great infusion of humor. This has actually been coming up for me a lot with some of our contributors. How surprised I've been about the use of humor in their work. I love like in your poem all denouement all the time, the opening lines of that, like those who die in their infancy are not assumed into heaven. They join the ranks of decommissioned public sculptures in some uncanny valley. And you know, there I mean I find myself chuckling at the lines, but it never feels gimmicky, and there's always this sense there's a gravitas there too. So it's like you can chuckle at it, but then like you come back and I kind of go, oh, like you know, like there's still like there's a weight there and stuff that's really that gives me pause. And I wonder for you, like how does humor unfold in your writing? Is it something that's, you know, is it intentional, or is it more of like a happy accident? And how do you feel it's beneficial to the, you know, to the work that you're doing?
I think for me, I don't think I ever, well, one of my formative influences as a writer was Nathaniel West.
Mm-hmm.
The when I read Miss Lonely Hearts, and I still have a tremendous amount of admiration for that book, because it is so you can't change a word in that book. Like it's a novel that functions incredibly well as a novel, but I mean it's so poetic in its use of language. Like every word is in the exact right place.
Mm-hmm.
It is also the darkest the blackest of black humor, right? Like it
Yeah,
is
yeah.
incredibly dark, incredibly serious at the same
Mm-hmm.
time. And it's written during the Great Depression. It's dealing with an incredibly dark moment in the history of the West. won't even say the United States. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
globally it was a thing, but anyway. So I think a certain kind of humor like that has always had an appeal to me.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think humor is terribly underrated in poetry and writing. Um, I think of Bob Kaufman too here, one of my
Mm-hmm.
favorite poets, because Bob Kaufman is often funny, but
Mm-hmm.
also, you feel the pang.
Yeah.
You feel the pain in that as well.
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes the humor is, to me, I never want to discount pleasure. And one of the pleasing things is something that, elicits that response that comes when we find something funny.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's very hard to be funny, but humor was also just important in my family growing up because my father was a polio survivor. He spent his entire life in a wheelchair, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
Like you had to cultivate a certain sense of humor just to get by from day to day.
Yeah. Yeah.
You had to have an outlook like that. And my father definitely used humor as a way to kind of cope with his physical situation. Yeah, I think it's a lot of different things, but I think at the end of the day, it really kind of comes down to the pleasure that people can take in reading and writing. Like that doesn't mean something's unserious or doesn't have the potential to be meaningful in a lasting way, I
Mm-hmm.
guess.
Mm-hmm.
And if something strikes someone as funny, that's great. I don't know that I can say that I ever set out to do that. What I probably set out to do is just do something that gives me pleasure, so I have an incentive to keep writing.
Yeah, it's interesting the because I've had moments where I've given readings and then someone will come up to me. This happened very recently where someone came up to me and said, you're very funny," and I was like, "Really?" Because I'm always like, I don't think my poems are that funny and stuff, and she was like, "No, they're very funny." I was definitely chuckling at this, at this certain point, and so I was kind of I always get a chuckle out of it and being able to like kind of surprise myself as well as like other people. Um, how has place affected your writing? I asked this question of Zeno Scott, and he had recently moved from the West Coast to the East Coast, and I was fascinated with the idea of transience and how that and travel and how that's impacted his writing. By contrast, you're native Texan. You were born, raised, and work and live in Dallas, and I'm just wondering how has living and working in the same city, influenced your growth as a poet and a writer?
Tremendously. Dallas does not have a strong literary presence, but it has a strong presence in the popular imagination.
Mm.
Here's what happens when I mention Dallas to folks, Oh, I've been to your airport. Is not in Dallas. Oh, Dallas Cowboys football, of course,
Mm-hmm.
and strong feelings about that, which I totally get because I have strong feelings about it, but whatever. JFK,
Uh huh.
and then the TV show,
Yeah.
and yeah, I would say place is something I'm thinking about a lot and always have been. If I have ambition as a writer, I think part of that ambition is definitely to bring greater representation to this place that I've known my entire life. And I mean, Dallas is a strange place. It's not just the Kennedy assassination. It's not just the football team. It's not just kind of your typical American urban sprawl, though there's a certain amount of that. I mean, my experience growing up in Dallas was very much an urban experience because of the part of Dallas I grew up in. When I was exposed to gentrification, excuse me, very early in life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm always thinking about local materials and trying to do something imaginative with them. And I think my writing practice has become even more sort of focused on Dallas and the local as I've gotten older.
Mm-hmm.
I think I kind of resisted maybe writing about it at first because like, oh, well, that would be quote unquote
Mm-hmm.
easy because it's available, but I've definitely, I mean, the poem that you mentioned earlier, All Day Anymore, All the Time, I mean, that's partly inspired by, the taking down of statues of
Mm-hmm.
Confederate figures here in Dallas, which, growing up, I grew up across the street from a elementary school named after Robert E. Lee.
Mm-hmm.
I
Hmm.
mean that tells you something about the culture here. I remember always thinking from a very early age, like, what's that all about? They lost, like, what the hell?
Yeah.
But anyway,
Yeah.
that's a whole other story. But I think also it's important for people outside of Texas to understand what's happening in Texas. I mean, I tell a lot of
Hmm.
people who've not been here, who've not spent any time here, or who think Texas equals Austin. It's much more than that.
Yeah.
Texas is in many ways a glimpse of a possible future. Texas is the place where a lot of the things that the far right-wing ideologues in this country test
Hmm.
their ideas. One of the reasons Roe versus Wade got struck down was because of things that were piloted here in Texas.
Yeah.
So it's easy to scoff at Texas and to have a lot of feelings of animosity toward Texas, and I totally
Hmm.
get it. Texas has earned those things. Absolutely. At the same time, you scoff at it at your own peril.
Yeah.
And I mean, Dallas is now the fourth largest metropolitan area in the United States. Like,
Hmm.
to me, there's material here, and I'm interested in doing more with that.
Hmm.
Yeah, I feel like that offers me opportunities to write about things that, I couldn't write about necessarily if I lived somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also thinking of Matt Gabbert, who
Hmm.
was the recently appointed Dallas Poet Laureate, and I met and spoke with her briefly when we were at AWP last, and she and I are pressmates by virtue of our chapbooks being on Cooper Dillon, but she also strikes me as being a very interesting person, especially to be appointed to such a visible like cultural ambassadorship, and and being so part of that like conversation. And so I'm, and I think it goes to your point that people make a lot of assumptions about what Texas is about without having like really put time and effort into understanding the complexity of Texas as a place containing multitudes, and
Yeah.
really just of like, yes, there are some very problematic things that are coming out of Texas politics, but culturally and through food, music, literature, and I definitely take your point that we scoff at our own peril, because I think not only just for the things that are maybe negative in nature, but also the things that, could enliven us and like enrich us, and be important for us to take into consideration. So, because like it's funny, because I think like with California, like we're on the opposite end of that spectrum and stuff, and so this is kind of seen as being the laboratory for whatever reason for progressive politics, but there's also a lot of like we have a lot of conservatism that's
Oh
still
yeah.
very much baked into the states, and so
Yeah.
it's a state of intense and unwieldy contradictions, and so it's the same thing. Like, people shouldn't make an assumption about what California is about, because it has a lot of different cultures and a lot of different things going on in it that are quite remarkable, and also heinous, and everything. So
Yeah, and I think another thing that I've been thinking about quite a bit is that Dallas does have a poetic tradition's not the right word, but Dallas there is a history of poetic practice in Dallas, and it is largely affiliated with working class communities, communities of color, and it's largely poetry that is not bound to the page. And so I am not a poet who is I am more comfortable on the page. But I've been thinking about like how to bring those two things together more in my work. Also just build community around the fact that we have poetry in Dallas, but it's from people and groups that are historically underrepresented.
mhm.
And Mag's predecessor as poet laureate of Dallas, I mean, he was the perfect choice, Joaquin Zihuatanejo, because Joaquin came up through that sort of more spoken word slam
Mhm.
world. And that's how he that's how he learned his craft.
Yeah.
So it's good to see Dallas now saying, okay, let's also now talk more about folks who work on the page and
Mhm.
you know Yeah, it's an interesting time to be a writer in Dallas. There's a lot that's been going on the last 10 years with Deep Vellum Books being here and just stronger interest, I think, in the literary arts.
Hmm.
And quite a few other authors who are here. Ben Fountain is here. Yeah, so it's not a bad time to be in Dallas.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. In addition to being a poet, as you had mentioned, you were also a novelist. And I was wondering if you could talk about how your fiction and your poetry influence one another, or if they're separate, and how maybe your writing process for fiction differs from your writing of poetry, and whether or not you have a preference for one genre over the other.
Mm, yeah, I think at one time novels meant a lot to me. I don't read a lot of novels anymore.
Mm,
Maybe my attention span is has atrophied. Uh, it's hard to say. I mean, I think poetry appeals because it in some ways it brings me closer to the materiality of language, which I talked about earlier, just being of
mhm,
interest to me. It's there's more opportunity for play, perhaps, but I don't know that I have another novel in me. I've been thinking about that. I mean, I have another novel that I need to finish, and then I have an idea maybe for something, but the prospect of carving out the time to pursue a novel like just seems folly,
mm,
really.
mhm.
It just takes so much. Like the sunk costs for novel writing to me seem particularly high.
Yeah.
But I do love some of the things you can do in fiction that often don't get done in poetry. So, like building characters,
Hmm.
exploring other points of view, thinking about scene and action and not even narrative,
Hmm.
but those things.
Hmm.
Thinking about the passage of time, thinking about the ordering of time and events that happens in narrative. And then I think novels are also, they're very much in about social relations.
Hmm.
And so, bringing more of that lens to poetry. I think my time at Cal Arts was also very influential in the sense that a big tenet of the program was to you weren't on a track, right?
Hmm.
Some people naturally sort of concentrated more on one genre than another, but you weren't asked to declare a genre and then, stick to it. And there's a lot of interest in hybrid work.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I've just kind of carried that with me. So whatever the subject matter is, whatever the thing that wants expression, whatever it kind of, shows a tendency to be, that's typically what I follow, And if that's a short story, okay. If that's a weird prose poem that goes on the back of a postcard, okay. If that's sort of more traditional poem with enjambment and stanzas and everything,
Hmm.
okay. If that's a novel, well, maybe not okay, but I'll consider it. So yeah, it's really about trusting what the work wants to be, not necessarily, yeah, yeah. What is it that the work wants?
Yeah.
I spent a lot of time thinking through that.
Yeah. Um, you're also an editor,
Hmm.
educator. You have a background doing design work. How do those disciplines influence your work?
I like making things. Um, yeah, I think the problems of making are just interesting to me across disciplines and
Hmm.
at TA. Education, some of the best conversations and friendships I've had have been over, built around talking about books and
Hmm.
artistic expression. So like I feel fortunate as an educator. I don't teach in like a college or university setting anymore. I haven't for a while. I make my living otherwise, but I stay involved as sort of a more informal educator, and I feel
Hmm.
real fortunate in that I still have students that I'm in touch with.
Yeah.
And now it's gotten to the point where we're just part of a writing group. And that's great. So I think for me, any way to be active and to be involved with other writers and readers and people who are interested in words, I will look for an opportunity to participate if I can,
Hmm.
time permitting. And yeah, working as an editor, I really started Surveyor Books as just a way to help other writers, as
Mm,
much as I could, because I know how hard it can be, especially getting that first book. Getting that
yeah,
first book is really difficult.
yeah,
And I've been really fortunate in my career, to kind of break through in various different places. So yeah, to me, it's just opportunities to stay involved in the community
yeah.
or different communities that make up the larger literary community.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you bring that up about the creation almost of like alternative venues for education. I am curious to see how these almost like alternative approaches will start to gain more traction as, people get priced out of like going to college and like,
Hmm.
and public education continues to suffer. And so, it will be interesting to see how these almost like alternative schools, alternative colleges and stuff will kind of start to crop up more to be able to help kind of fill gaps and
Yeah,
maybe provide an alternative to kind of, traditional pedagogy and stuff that people are used to following in especially in this country.
yeah. Literature and access to literature and access to the tools of self-expression are part of important quality of life measures.
Yeah.
And so keeping them accessible is just a good thing overall.
Yes.
It's why in a lot of neighborhoods, in neighborhoods that need economic development, you ask residents often what are the kind of businesses they would like to have in their neighborhoods. What do they say? They say a bookstore, right? Libraries play an incredibly important role
Yes.
in communities in that way too. And so, yeah, I mean, I serve on the board of a literary nonprofit here in Dallas. It's a place I used to work. And yeah, I mean, we're really pursuing those ideas as much as we can here in Dallas, to reach underserved communities, to find ways to connect with the people who are looking for literary expression and however you want to understand that, and to make it accessible to them as much as
Hmm.
possible. And that to me is exciting work, hopefully I'll have more to say about that in the near future.
Cool. Um, to shift gears, you selected Lattice by Jerry Hunt for our Spotify playlist. And I
Oh
was
yeah.
curious, why did you choose this particular song and how or why does it have influence on your work as a writer?
So, Jerry Hunt is someone I should have known about years ago, but only learned about in the last 2 years. He was from Dallas. He was a pioneer in electronic music and also a kind of performance art. He grew up in Dallas. He lived almost his entire professional life in Dallas, but at some point he moved to a community outside of Dallas called Canton. And yeah, I mean, like an early sort of champion of people like Cage and other sort of he reminded me a lot of people I knew growing up, and also my father, in the sense that he chose to stay in this place, Dallas, which is urban and a large city and a regional center and all of that sort of stuff, but it's remote and it's a place other people of like mind aren't necessarily going to come.
Hmm.
And so a lot of his relationships artistically were these long distance relationships. He
Hmm.
had correspondence with people. He helped bring their music to audiences in Dallas. He would travel to them. They wouldn't necessarily travel to him. And Lattice is one of Jerry's more approachable pieces that works as a standalone listening piece. A lot of his work is really, you have to see their performance to really
Mm,
understand what he's doing, because there are electronics that are responding to gestures and things that he's doing in real time.
yeah.
So it doesn't really translate to just a pure recorded audio medium.
Yeah.
But Lattice is a really wonderful example of what a really incredible piano player he was.
Mm,
And I chose it just because, I think it kind of speaks back to things we were talking about earlier. It's a point of local pride for me
yeah.
to a certain
Yeah.
extent. I mean, I find it very telling. Nobody here in Dallas that I've talked to is they knew who Jerry Hunt was. And yet the big catalog of Jerry Hunt's work and the reissues of his music have come from an outfit in New York. And he had a reputation in New York for a time in the 80s because he did some work with Karen Finlay.
Mm,
who's much more well known.
Hmm.
But he was fierce, he famously wrote a letter to the I believe he wrote a letter to the it was either I think it was the NEA because he had some funding. The whole NEA 9 and all the controversy around funding of the arts in the 80s.
Hmm.
He was a very vocal supporter of the kind of work that was being denied funding. And
Yeah.
in any event, yeah, just hopefully bring a little bit more light to an artist deserving of wider recognition.
Yeah.
And I think it is a rather beautiful piece of music, even if it is a little spiky and not what you would necessarily expect from a solo piano recital. But yeah, those are the reasons I chose Lattice by Jerry Hunt.
That's cool. That's very cool. I love that you chose that because I was not familiar with his work. Lastly, can you tell our listeners where to find you and where to find more of your work?
Yeah, I have a website. It's www.joe-milazzo, milazzo.com. There are links there to books. There's links there to writing that's appeared in journals, links to all my social profiles and, various and sundry things going on there. There's also a link to surveyor books. So if folks want to learn more about surveyor books, they can. And the 3 books that we've published so far. You can all find that at my website. Yeah. And links to my Bandcamp as well, where I occasionally put out bursts of horrible noise.
Nice. Joe, this has been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time. I've really
Thank
enjoyed
you.
our discussion, and
Me too.
we will hopefully see each other in person at some point. So
That would be
yeah,
great.
it'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, isn't AWP in
It
LA next
is.
year?
Yes. Yeah. So
Oh,
I would if you're coming out, I would love to see you. So for sure.
I'll let you
Yeah,
know
that
for
would be
sure.
awesome.
I think my partner has said, like we need to go back to LA. It's actually been a while.
That would be, and to see CalArts folks and kind of
Yeah, there's a
reconnect.
few left.
Yeah. They're around. Thank you to Karla Lamb and Joseph Milazzo for joining us on this episode. Please be sure to like and subscribe. And if you're enjoying the podcast, leave us a review.
You can find our most recent and all past issues at brokenlensjournal.com. Keep an eye out for issue 10 in January of 2025.
Our theme music is composed and was recorded by Art Santora. I'm Adam.
And I'm Heather.
Thanks for listening.
Bye.